The US suffers its second biggest bank collapse ever, triggering fears for lenders around the globe. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese heads to the US to unveil Australia's big spend on used submarines, and lithium companies get hammered as the price of the metal hits a year-long low. It's Monday, the 13th of March, 2023. Welcome to Fear and Greed, Australia's most popular business podcast. I'm Michael Thompson, and good morning, Sean Aylmer.
Good morning, Michael.
Sean, a large chunk of the country is on a public holiday today, but we're here pretty much every day, aren't we?
Whether it's a public holiday in your state or not, we will always be here.
Because business news never sleeps, right?
That's right. Something like that. Yeah,
something along those lines. Look, we've still got a great interview coming up after the show. You're speaking with Annie Le Cavalier, the Director of Strategic Growth Programs at Stone and Chalk.
Yes, it's all about startups and scale-ups and getting entrepreneurial businesses around the country to kind of just grow that little bit faster, do that little bit better. It's a really fascinating chat with Annie about what Stone and Chalk are doing to help these businesses.
Now, the main story this morning, though, Sean, is a big one. It is a really important story. The US suffered its second largest bank failure in history over the weekend. Silicon Valley Bank, a regional lender mostly to tech startups, collapsed, was forcibly shut down. And now there's fears that it will actually trigger a run on banks around the world.
Yes, so a little explanation first. The US system has major players. Think of Citigroup, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, etc., and a bunch of regional banks. Now, Silicon Valley Bank is one of the regionals, and it mostly lent to venture capitalists and tech startups. Last week, it came out and said it had sold $21 billion in assets to shore up its balance sheet. That triggered panic, with queues forming outside branches as people tried to get their money out. Over the weekend, it was shut down by regulators and taken over by the federal government in the US. It's a federally insured mutual, which means depositors can get out up to $250,000. But many will have much, much more than that. In fact, anecdotally, there are stories of people and organisations with more than $10 million in the bank. It adds to the melee of the tech sector, which has shed thousands of jobs recently, and follows the failure of crypto lender Silvergate Bank just last week. The fear is that customers will start shifting money from these regional banks to the large lenders, which will cause a run on deposits for all the smaller players, leading to a crash of the regionals. Now, rising interest rates and the promise of several more hikes in the US is triggering alarm among investors, particularly the banks. Wall Street fell again over the weekend. This collapse of Silicon Valley Bank came as labour force data showed both a surge in jobs, more than 300,000 new jobs were created last month in the US, but very significantly, slower wages growth than anticipated. That's the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank and the slower wages growth triggered a fall in bond yields. Now, bond yields reflect expectations of future interest rate rises, so investors think that the bank collapse, plus the good news on wages growth, might just stifle the Federal Reserve's rate rise cycle. Plenty going on there, Michael.
Yeah, just a little bit. I mentioned, though, before the fears that it could trigger a run on banks around the world. Could it happen here? Are local banks safe?
It could always happen, but it is unlikely. Now, a big part of the problem for both Silicon Valley Bank and Silvergate is that they both lent primarily to very narrow segments of the market. So tech startups and venture capital in the case of Silicon Valley, and crypto businesses in the case of Silvergate. Local banks are much, much broader than that, and they're more reliant on the relatively safe home lending market. In a sense, the fact that we're not as big as the US means that our banks have to serve all sorts of customers, whereas you get a lot more niche players in the US. Yesterday, Federal Treasurer Jim Chalmers said the government is working closely with local regulators, that would be APRA, the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority, and the tech sector to understand how the collapse will impact the local businesses. But other countries are very worried. British Chancellor Jeremy Hunt held emergency talks over the weekend on how to stop the collapse from hitting the UK tech sector. Some of the big Canadian banks are worried because in recent years, they've purchased a bunch of these regional US banks. The last thing they need is a run on regional banks. So there's plenty of fear globally about what's going on.
And just still kind of looking at the local impact, Sean, will it hit the local market when it opens today?
Yes, it's hard to see the ASX 200 doing very well today, with banks and tech companies likely to come under pressure. Now, last week wasn't a great one for the local bourse anyway. It ended down nearly 2% for the week. Most of the fall, in fact, more than most, happened in Friday's trading, with the S&P ASX 200 closing the session down 2.3% to 7,145 points. Now, close to 90% of stocks fell on Friday, and the market was led lower by the energy, materials and financial sectors. No good news for the big four banks or Macquarie Group. All of those were off around 3%. Same deal with the big energy companies, Woodside and Santos. BHP, Fortescue Metals and Rio were also down close to 3%. The best performers on Friday were the defensive stocks. CSL was down only 1.5%. Telstra, Wesfarmers and Coles all went backwards, but by less than 1%, which was a pretty good performance. Woolworths actually ended in the black, and along with Transurban, was one of only two top 20 companies to do so. The gold companies also bucked the trend, with Evolution Mining, Northern Star, Gold Road Resources and market leader Newcrest all in the black for the day. The best for the session was Origin Energy, up 2.5%.
Sean, as we mentioned before, it may be a public holiday for quite a few places around the country, but there is a lot of business news happening today. We'll be back in a moment with the rest of the day's business news. Sean, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese is off to the US to stand next to US President Joe Biden and UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and announce that Australia will buy 5 US used submarines.
Yes, while we're waiting for our new subs to be built, we'll take delivery of Virginia-class subs, which will definitely cost less than the $7 billion or so slated for the new vessels. Yesterday, Albanese said the government will spend whatever it takes, and AUKUS architect Scott Morrison, the former Prime Minister, said the defence budget will need to lift 2.5% of GDP, which is almost another $9 billion a year. We'll find out about that in May when the government hands down the budget. Meanwhile, US Congressman Joe Courtney, speaking on ABC radio yesterday, said Australia will receive high-quality nuclear submarines under the AUKUS Pact, arguing America will not be, quote, foistering off clunkers on good friends and allies. Love that. He said the US will need Australian workers to build new submarines and that the AUKUS deal will help Australia to develop its own skilled workforce needed to build boats. That announcement is expected tomorrow morning Australian time.
That's kind of reassuring to know that we're not getting clunkers.
It is.
But who do you reckon does the inspection of it? I mean, who's qualified to inspect a used submarine? And what are you looking for? And actually, here's a question for you. What if you're inspecting it without the intention to buy? A tyre kicker, is it like the equivalent of a periscope puncher or something?
Possibly. I like that, a periscope puncher. Well, what I want to know really is, why is it used? Why are they getting rid of it?
Oh, that's right. Yeah, these are the questions that need to be asked here, Sean. Maybe we should be going in to inspect these submarines for them.
Yes, the periscope punchers amongst us. I like it.
All right, Sean, let's move on. Chinese buyers dominate the list of foreign investors buying Australian residential real estate, with $1.6 billion in proposed purchases approved in the final 6 months of last year.
Yes, and this is while borders were effectively closed and before the Chinese government told students they had to physically attend foreign universities if enrolled. So it's a fair bet demand will grow. This is probably good for house prices. Now, the Foreign Investment Review Board figures show Chinese buyers dominated last year, buying 4 times as much as the next geography, which was Hong Kong. Then came Vietnamese buyers, then the UK, Malaysia and India. So much interest from China really should help put a floor on further price falls, particularly in the capital cities and particularly around apartments.
Yeah, good news around house prices. Sean, last week we spoke of the demise of the coal companies, performance-wise, that is, relative to other ASX-listed companies since late last year. Now, the other darling sector of 2022, lithium stocks, are also finding the going a bit tough.
They are. The benchmark price for the battery ingredient hit a 1-year low in China late last week, and the leading producers listed on the ASX tumbled. Pilbara Minerals fell 7% on Friday. It's down nearly 20% since late January, which was the latest peak for the lithium stocks. IGO was off 7% late last week. It's down 17% since the January peak. Allcom fell 9% on Friday and is off 15%. Now, speculative explorers also fell sharply. The bottom line here is lower demand from China And China makes about 76% of the world's batteries. So as the price of lithium falls, so too do the share prices of the lithium companies, which means the coal companies and lithium companies are having a pretty dreadful 2023.
Toll road giant Transurban has abandoned a $9 billion project to upgrade expressways in Maryland on the US East Coast, blaming delays to environmental approvals.
It's the cost of focusing on the environment, delays to major not-so-green projects. Now, Transurban said it had negotiated with the Maryland Department of Transportation in good faith, but the project continues to face challenges, including significant delays to environmental approvals, a changing political landscape, and unresolved environmental lawsuits. The axed project was set to involve high occupancy toll lanes totaling 60 kilometres of highway. It was expected to be one of the largest public-private partnerships in the US, but it just seems that the bureaucracy has beaten it.
Yeah, I don't think an expressway kind of falls into the category of just build it and just kind of ask forgiveness later.
No, that's true. But it is a very interesting point that, we all, drive on roads and we need expressways and things like that, but there is an environmental cost to that. And I'm sure Transurban would argue that you actually have to be able to do business and build these roads without being hampered too much by the environmental red tape.
By frogs.
By frogs. That's exactly right.
I'm assuming it's frogs because remember, wasn't it with the Sydney Olympics? Was it the golden bell frog or something like that? Didn't that cause all kinds of kerfuffle?
Yes, I'd forgotten about that. It's always frogs, isn't it, really?
It really is. I say, you look at every single major environmental delay and there is a frog behind it.
Moving on.
Yep, let's move on. This next one's an interesting one, Sean. The world's biggest precious metals exchange, the London Bullion Marketing Association, has announced an investigation into allegations about the Perth Mint, just as the West Australian government ignores calls for a royal commission.
Yeah, so the London Bullion Marketing Association has launched an incident review process into the Western Australian taxpayer-owned mint. Amid allegations, it tried to cover up the sale of less than pure gold to the Shanghai Gold Exchange and only stopped the practice after its biggest customer complained. Adverse findings under the incident review process can result in refineries being struck off the LBMA's good delivery list of entities accredited to supply gold and silver. Now, the LBMA said it would review the current circumstances at the mint, which is already under investigation by Australia's financial crimes regulator in relation to compliance concerns under the Anti-Money Laundering and Counter-Terrorism Financing Act. Western Australian Premier Mark McGowan last week said he had no knowledge of so-called gold doping at the mint, but obviously members of that sector are more concerned about it than the WA Premier.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story and we'll be watching it as it unfolds. In international news, Sean, the battle for green energy production globally is heating up with the European Union clearing the way for incentive matching to keep projects in the region.
Yeah, so thus far we've had the US Inflation Reduction Act, which provides significant assistance. In fact, that's an understatement. It's huge assistance, about $369 billion worth of subsidies and tax credits for clean energy projects. Now, the European Union says it will allow member states to match multi-billion-dollar incentives as they fight to keep projects in Europe. For the first time, state subsidies within the bloc can be large-scale matching subsidies. They'll also allow states to put billions of euros into the production of solar panels, batteries, wind turbines, electrolyzers and heat pumps. Bottom line in all this, there's going to be a surge in the production of green energy because of these massive incentives provided initially by the US but now matched by the European Union. Now, Michael, at this point, I'd like to digress, if you'll give me the liberty. Anyone who hasn't or didn't listen to the weekend edition really should go back because it's always a great battle between Michael and I about the big stories of the week. And I lost last week. Michael came through with a win. I was very dirty about one of the categories I lost, which was the sleeper category. And my story was all about how governments were changing rules around resource projects and providing great incentives and how the boss of BHP had warned the Australian government it needed to get in line, et cetera, et cetera. Not that I'm dirty for losing, but I'd just like to say this story backs mine up perfectly, Michael.
I just love that you clearly do not let anything go, ever.
Our judge and colleague Adam Lang has a lot to answer for. Let's hope he's not hearing this particular conversation, though.
And I look forward to this coming weekend, the weekend edition, when I'm sure he will be held to account.
Yes, I'm sure he will.
Now, Sean, it's not very often on Fear and Greed that we get to discuss volcanoes.
No.
So today is, in fact, one of those days when we do get to discuss volcanoes, because over the weekend, Indonesia's most active volcano erupted, triggering gas clouds and lava flows, and it forced authorities to halt tourism and mining activities.
Mount Merapi on the densely populated island of Java unleashed clouds of hot ash and a mixture of rock, lava and gas that travelled up to 7 kilometres down its slopes, according to Associated Press. Now, a column of hot clouds rose 100 metres into the air, and the eruption throughout the day blocked out the sun and blanketed several villages with falling ash. No casualties, fortunately, have been reported. It was Merapi's biggest lava flow since authorities raised the alert level to the second highest in November back in 2020. The near 3,000-metre mountain is about 30 kilometres from Yogyakarta. About 250,000 people live within 10 kilometres of the volcano.
And finally, Sean, there is quite the row at the moment over the suspension of the BBC's highest paid commentator, Gary Lineker, after he criticised the government's migration policy.
Yes, so presenters have mutinied in support of Lineker, and the BBC was forced to axe most of its sports coverage on Saturday. Earlier, the BBC sought to defend its impartiality by taking Lineker off the air due to his comments on social media. Now, he's the former England soccer captain and the anchor of the football highlights program Match of the Day. You can imagine in the UK, Gary Lineker is as close to royalty without being royal.
Yep.
Yeah. Anyway, critics of Lineker's suspension say the BBC bowed to government pressure, leading to a furious debate about the impartiality of the national broadcaster. Sounds a little bit familiar, doesn't it, really?
I was just thinking, as you were saying this, I'm like, we have been through all of this with the ABC, even just in the last 6 months.
Yeah. Now, according to a report in the Financial Times, BBC Director General Tim Davie said he had no intention of resigning over the matter. There you go.
All right. Now, up next is the Fear and Greed Daily interview with Annie Le Cavalier, the Director of Strategic Growth Programs at Stone and Chalk.
Yes, the discussion with Annie was all about startups and scale-ups and how Stone and Chalk is supporting their growth via all sorts of things, partnerships with governments right through to community groups that are helping each other. A fascinating chat about that part of the market.
Yeah, it's coming up next in the Fear and Greed playlist on your podcast platform or at fearandgreed.com.au. And Annie's actually a judge in the startup component of the Accounting Business Expo, which is on in Melbourne tomorrow and Wednesday. It's a supporter of this podcast, and you can find more information just by searching Accounting Business Expo. Also, Sean, coming up, we have the week ahead with our resident economist, Stephen Koukoulas, a little quieter this week.
Yes, a little quieter, but that doesn't quieten Stephen Koukoulas, a man who loves his job and very enthusiastic about business sentiment this week and consumer sentiment and kind of what's going on in global economics too. It's such a big story at the moment.
Yep, sure is. Well worth a listen. Thank you very much, Sean.
Thank you, Michael.
It's Monday, the 13th of March, 2023. Make sure you're following the podcast and join us online on LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. I'm Michael Thompson, and that was Fear and Greed. Have a great day.